Snow had begun to fall before the first carriage arrived, drifting down in soft, deliberate silence that seemed almost merciful against the brilliance of Halverton House, where every window blazed with candlelight and expectation. Within its marble entrance hall, footmen in powdered wigs received cloaked ladies as though ushering them into a theatre where reputations might be performed or undone before midnight. It was there, upon the threshold between warmth and winter, that Miss Eleanor Whitcombe paused longer than courtesy allowed, her gloved hand resting lightly against the carved balustrade as though steadying herself against a tremor no one else could see. She had been advised not to attend. 2 separate acquaintances had written, in language carefully disguised as concern, that London was not always kind to young ladies who lingered too long near dukes. Yet Eleanor stepped forward at last, surrendering her cloak to a servant with calm composure because dignity, once threatened, could only be defended by appearing exactly where one was least expected to stand. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers spilled golden light across silk gowns that shimmered like restless water, while violins climbed gently toward a waltz already in progress. Conversations floated upward in polite fragments, each one shaped with exquisite restraint, yet sharpened beneath the surface by curiosity. Eleanor felt those glances settle upon her before she had taken 3 steps across the parquet floor, and she knew at once that rumor had outrun her arrival. Still she walked forward. Her gown, modestly cut in pale blue satin, seemed almost too simple among the elaborate lace and velvet that surrounded her, yet its quiet elegance suited her better than ornament would have done. Beneath her left glove, hidden where no one might suspect its importance, rested the slender chain of a silver snowdrop pendant whose fragile bloom pressed coolly against her wrist. It had been given in confidence, and she had worn it tonight because she believed, until that very hour, that promises spoken softly might still carry weight beneath chandeliers. Across the length of the ballroom stood His Grace, Adrian Hawthorne, Duke of Halverton. He did not laugh as loudly as the gentleman beside him, nor gesture with unnecessary flourish, yet even at a distance he possessed the composed authority of a man accustomed to being watched. His dark coat was cut with severe elegance, his posture unyielding, his expression unreadable except for a brief tightening at the corner of his mouth when their eyes met across the crowded floor. That single movement, so slight it might have escaped another observer entirely, told Eleanor everything she feared and nothing she hoped. He had not expected her. Or perhaps he had hoped she would not come. She crossed the room nevertheless. Each step felt measured not by distance but by memory, for she could still recall the quiet library at Halverton House 3 weeks earlier, the low murmur of rain against the tall windows, and the steadiness with which he had taken her hand as though the world beyond that room had ceased to exist entirely. No witness had stood between them then. No whisper had interrupted what passed unspoken in his silence. Now the world stood everywhere. When she reached him, conversation around him faltered with subtle precision, as though society itself leaned closer to listen without appearing to do so. The Duke inclined his head politely, neither warmly nor coldly, yet with the exact courtesy one might extend to a distant acquaintance encountered unexpectedly in a crowded square. "Your Grace," Eleanor said quietly, though her voice did not tremble. He regarded her for a moment longer than etiquette required, and in that pause she believed, foolishly perhaps, that recognition would soften him. Instead he answered with a composure so perfect it seemed almost rehearsed. "Madam," he replied, "I fear you mistake me for another gentleman entirely." The words were spoken gently enough that no one could accuse him of cruelty, yet their effect struck with unmistakable force. A silence spread outward from them like frost across glass. Eleanor felt it reach the nearest cluster of ladies first, then the gentlemen beyond them, until every nearby voice had softened into watchful stillness. She did not move. For an instant she wondered whether she had misunderstood him, whether some elaborate courtesy concealed meaning she had not yet grasped, yet his expression remained unchanged, and the careful distance in his eyes told her what explanation could not. He was denying her. Not privately. Not discreetly. Before everyone. A lady beside them raised her fan to conceal a whisper that nevertheless carried just far enough to be heard. "How unfortunate," the woman murmured, "when imagination replaces virtue." Another voice answered with delicate sympathy sharpened by curiosity. "One cannot blame His Grace for protecting himself." Eleanor felt the words settle upon her shoulders like cold snow that would not melt. She had imagined many possibilities before entering the ballroom that evening: hesitation, confusion, even reluctance. But never this calm refusal to acknowledge that anything had ever passed between them at all. "Your Grace," she said again more softly now, "I assure you there is no mistake." He inclined his head once more, his tone unchanged. "Then I regret the inconvenience," he answered. It was not anger that rose within her then, nor even despair, but a strange, suspended clarity, as though the entire room had shifted slightly beyond her reach. She understood suddenly that any protest would only confirm what society already wished to believe, and that silence, however unjust, remained her only defense against destruction. So she curtsied. It was not a deep curtsy, nor a careless one, but precisely the gesture required to acknowledge a stranger of rank whom one would not trouble again. When she straightened, she did not meet his eyes a second time. Instead she turned. The journey across the ballroom toward the doors seemed longer than the approach had been, though no one attempted to stop her. Conversations resumed as she passed, carefully lowered yet unmistakably present, and she understood that by morning every drawing room in London would repeat some version of what had occurred beneath those chandeliers. Outside, snow had gathered more thickly upon the carriage steps than she remembered, and the night air felt sharper than before, as though winter itself had taken notice of her departure. She drew her cloak closer around her shoulders, though it did nothing to steady the quiet realization settling within her heart. She was 6 weeks with child, and the only man who could claim that truth had just denied ever knowing her. She had almost reached the waiting line of hired carriages when another vehicle halted beside her with deliberate authority, its polished door opening before she could step aside. From within emerged a gloved hand older than her own, steady yet unmistakably commanding, followed by a voice she recognized from whispered introductions and distant observations at assemblies she had never expected to enter closely. The interior of the Dowager Duchess's carriage was warmer than Eleanor expected, yet the warmth carried none of comfort's softness. It felt instead like the controlled heat of a room prepared for judgment rather than refuge. Thick velvet curtains muffled the noise of the street, and the lantern fixed beside the opposite seat cast a steady amber glow across the dowager's composed features, revealing eyes far sharper than her silver hair and measured stillness suggested. Eleanor settled opposite her without protest, folding her hands carefully in her lap because she sensed at once that any visible agitation would be noted and remembered. Outside, the wheels resumed their slow passage across frozen stones, and Halverton House faded behind them like a stage whose performance had ended without applause. For several moments the Dowager Duchess did not speak. She studied Eleanor with the quiet attention of a woman long accustomed to separating truth from performance, and Eleanor understood that this silence was not uncertainty but examination. "At what hour," the Duchess said at last, "did my son first persuade you that he intended to marry you?" The question arrived so directly that Eleanor could not disguise its significance behind politeness. "He never spoke the word persuade," she answered with equal steadiness. "He spoke the word promise." The Dowager inclined her head slightly, as though acknowledging a difference of consequence rather than sentiment. "And you believed him?" "Yes." "And tonight he denied you?" "He did." The carriage turned sharply, and the movement shifted the lantern's light so that the Duchess's expression passed briefly into shadow before returning with renewed clarity. "My son," she said quietly, "does not abandon responsibility through cowardice. Therefore either he has been compelled into silence, or he has been deceived into believing silence necessary." Eleanor felt those words strike deeper than comfort could have done, for they replaced humiliation with uncertainty, and uncertainty with something far more dangerous: hope. "I would not accuse his grace unjustly," Eleanor said carefully. "Yet I cannot pretend his denial alters what has already passed between us." "No," the Duchess replied. "It alters only what society believes has passed." The carriage slowed as they entered a quieter square, where frost gathered along iron railings like pale lace. The Duchess opened a small traveling case resting beside her and withdrew a velvet box so familiar in shape that Eleanor's breath caught before she could prevent it. She placed it between them without ceremony. "You may recognize this." Eleanor did not touch it immediately. She knew before opening it what lay inside, for she had seen that ring only once before, when the Duke pressed his signet into sealing wax beside her name on a letter he insisted she keep. "My lady," she said at last, "I cannot accept such a thing." "You misunderstand," the Duchess answered. "It is not offered. It is entrusted." Eleanor opened the lid despite herself. Inside lay the Duke's signet ring, its engraved crest unmistakable even in the carriage's dim light. "My son left this upon his writing desk yesterday morning," the Duchess continued. "He has never done such a thing before leaving the house. It was not oversight. It was intention." Eleanor's fingers trembled despite her effort to remain composed. "What intention could that be?" "To ensure it reached you." The words settled between them with deliberate weight. "He expected me to deliver it?" Eleanor asked. "He expected someone he trusted to do so," the Duchess replied. Unfortunately for him, I am the only person who noticed it had been left behind. Eleanor closed the velvet box slowly, feeling its significance deepen rather than resolve the confusion gathering around her. If he meant to protect me, she said quietly, his protection has already cost me everything. The Duchess regarded her for a moment with something that might almost have been admiration. Not everything, she said. Not yet. They reached Eleanor's modest lodging soon after, though the street outside appeared less welcoming than it had that morning, as if the house itself understood that its tenant's position had altered in the eyes of the world. The Duchess did not remain seated once the carriage stopped but stepped down first, insisting upon escorting Eleanor to the door despite the lateness of the hour. It was only when they stood beneath the narrow awning that she spoke again. You must leave London, she said. Eleanor stared at her in astonishment. I cannot vanish merely because society prefers it. You cannot remain because society demands it, the Duchess answered calmly. There are whispers already, and whispers rarely travel alone. I will not run from falsehood. You may soon be forced to run from something far less false. Before Eleanor could reply, footsteps approached along the pavement with hurried determination. A tall gentleman emerged from the fogged edge of lamplight, his military bearing unmistakable even before his face became visible. Miss Whitcombe, he said with restrained urgency, bowing quickly. Forgive the hour. I was instructed to find you. Eleanor recognized him at once. Captain Arthur Pembroke, the Duke's closest companion and most trusted ally. He extended a sealed envelope without explanation, though his expression carried the weight of a message he would rather not deliver aloud. This was placed in my care earlier this evening, he said quietly. I was told it must reach you before morning. The Duchess watched him with interest but did not interfere. Eleanor accepted the letter, sensing at once that its thickness suggested something more than apology or farewell. The paper felt heavier than ordinary correspondence, as though it carried decisions rather than words. You may open it now, Pembroke added softly. She broke the seal. Inside lay not a letter alone but a folded bank draft bearing a sum so large it startled her breath into stillness, accompanied by a single unsigned sentence written in the Duke's unmistakable hand. Leave London immediately. For your safety. Eleanor looked up sharply, her pulse quickening with sudden dread. Safety from whom? She asked. Captain Pembroke hesitated only once before answering. From the announcement that will appear in tomorrow morning's papers, he said. The Duke of Halverton is to be married within the month. Morning arrived in London with a brittle stillness that seemed to echo the shock Eleanor carried within her, for the frost upon her narrow windowpane had formed delicate white patterns resembling fractured flowers, and she could not look upon them without thinking of the snowdrop pendant still hidden beneath her sleeve, its fragile promise now shadowed by the words Captain Pembroke had spoken beneath the lamplight the previous evening. She did not sleep. Instead she remained seated beside the small writing desk until dawn pressed reluctantly through the curtains, the Duke's unsigned warning resting before her like a silent command she could neither obey nor refuse without consequence. To leave London meant surrendering her name to speculation. To remain meant confronting a marriage announcement that would bury her truth beneath another lady's fortune. When her landlady knocked gently to deliver tea, her usual politeness carried a careful distance that had not existed before, and Eleanor understood at once that rumor had already begun its quiet migration through staircases and parlors where sympathy rarely survived long without proof. You have received callers this morning, miss? The woman said cautiously. I have received no invitations, Eleanor replied. No invitations, the landlady agreed, lowering her voice, but inquiries. The distinction required no explanation. Eleanor dismissed the tray untouched and rose at last, knowing that delay would only deepen the uncertainty gathering around her like mist that thickened rather than lifted with daylight. She wrapped her cloak carefully about her shoulders and placed the Duke's signet ring, still enclosed in its velvet box, into her reticule because she could not yet decide whether it represented protection or farewell. By noon she had resolved upon departure. The carriage arranged for her journey waited discreetly in a side street beyond the square, its driver instructed to avoid unnecessary notice, and she stepped toward it with a composure that surprised even herself, as though movement alone offered temporary shelter from the questions she refused to answer aloud. Yet London did not release her so easily. They had not reached the northern road before the carriage slowed abruptly, the horses stamping against the frost-hardened stones as though reluctant to proceed farther without permission from something unseen. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Is there some difficulty? There is a gentleman in the road, miss, the driver answered through the small window, his voice uncertain. The carriage door opened before she could reply. Cold air rushed inward, and with it came the unmistakable presence she had feared and hoped to see in equal measure. The Duke of Halverton stood beside the wheel, hatless beneath a sky still heavy with unfallen snow, his dark coat damp with frost that had gathered along its shoulders as though he had ridden hard without regard for weather or distance. For several moments neither spoke. Then he stepped inside the carriage and closed the door behind him with quiet finality that transformed the confined space into something dangerously intimate. "You intended to leave," he said, though his tone suggested he had known it already. "You instructed me to do so," Eleanor answered. His gaze moved briefly to her reticule, where the outline of the velvet box rested against the fabric. "I hoped you would trust me," he said. "I hoped you would acknowledge me," she replied. The words lingered between them, sharper than accusation yet gentler than reproach, and he closed his eyes briefly as though their truth required endurance rather than defense. "You must believe," he said at last, "that what I did last night was not done lightly." "I believe it was done deliberately," she answered. "Yes." The simplicity of his agreement startled her more than denial could have done. "I was watched," he continued quietly. "Every movement I made within that ballroom was observed by persons who expected me to deny you." "Expected," she repeated. "Required," he corrected. Eleanor's breath caught despite herself. "Required by whom?" He hesitated only long enough to reveal the weight of the answer he carried. "By those who hold my estates in their favor and my tenants' futures in their hands." Understanding moved through her slowly, reshaping the humiliation she had endured into something darker and more complicated than betrayal alone. "You mean to say," she said carefully, "that silence was demanded of you as the price of their security?" "Yes." "And your marriage?" "My marriage," he answered, "was arranged as the assurance that silence would continue." The carriage seemed suddenly smaller, the air between them thinner than before, and Eleanor realized that what she had taken for abandonment might instead be sacrifice performed without her consent. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" she asked. "Because I believed I could end it without placing you in danger," he replied. "I was wrong." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded letter she recognized at once by the careful curve of her own handwriting across its outer edge. "You wrote this 3 weeks ago," he said. "Yes." "I never received it." Her heart faltered. "It was returned to me unopened yesterday morning." The realization struck her with quiet force. Someone had intercepted their correspondence. Someone had ensured misunderstanding would grow where trust might have survived. "You see now," he said softly, "why I could not claim you before witnesses who expected me to deny you." "And yet you still intend to marry her," Eleanor said. His silence answered before his voice did. "Yes." She turned her face slightly toward the carriage window, where frost blurred the passing streets into indistinct shapes that might have belonged to another city entirely. "I am 6 weeks with child," she whispered then, unable to carry the truth alone any longer. The Duke did not speak. He did not move. For one suspended instant she feared he might deny her again even here, within the narrow shelter of a carriage already moving beyond London's reach. Instead his hand closed slowly over the velvet box resting beside her. "I will not permit you to face this alone," he said at last, though the promise carried uncertainty rather than certainty, "but you must trust me once more and continue your journey north without delay." Before she could answer, he opened the carriage door and stepped back into the falling snow, leaving her with the echo of his words and the sudden discovery that beneath the velvet box lay a folded newspaper clipping announcing that his wedding was not weeks away as reported, but tomorrow morning. Morning broke over London with a brightness too deliberate to be mistaken for kindness, for the pale winter sun struck the cathedral's high windows with a clarity that seemed intended to expose rather than bless, and Eleanor Whitcombe felt that same merciless light settle upon her shoulders as her hired carriage halted at the edge of the crowded square where society had gathered to witness the marriage of a duke. She had not intended to return. Yet intention had become a fragile thing since the moment she discovered the altered date printed beneath the announcement concealed within her carriage, and the knowledge that Adrian Hawthorne would be bound to another woman before the following dusk had transformed hesitation into necessity with a force she could neither resist nor delay. The square outside the cathedral shimmered with movement. Carriages arrived in orderly succession, their wheels crunching over frost while ladies descended in winter silks that flashed with pale color against the gray morning, each one eager to witness what rumor had already promised would be the most advantageous union of the season. No one expected Miss Eleanor Whitcombe to step from her modest vehicle among them. She felt the first ripple of recognition move through the gathering crowd like a sudden disturbance across still water, yet she did not lower her gaze nor retreat toward the shelter of her carriage door, for retreat would have confirmed every whisper already spoken in her absence. Instead she walked forward. The snowdrop pendant lay hidden beneath her glove once more, its delicate shape pressing faintly against her wrist as though reminding her that promises once spoken could not be erased by silence alone. Inside the cathedral the air carried the scent of candle wax and evergreen garlands arranged with ceremonial precision along the aisles, their fragrance mingling with the subdued murmur of anticipation that filled every pew long before the bridal party appeared. Eleanor paused only once beneath the vaulted entrance. Captain Arthur Pembroke stood waiting there as though he had expected her arrival despite every reason she had given to the contrary. "You should not have come," he said quietly, though his voice held neither reproach nor surprise. "Then you should have warned me sooner," she answered with equal calm. His expression shifted, not toward disagreement but toward resignation. "It is already in motion," he said. "There are witnesses enough to bind the ceremony beyond interruption." "Witnesses bind only what is spoken truthfully," Eleanor replied. He studied her for a moment longer before stepping aside. "You will have little time," he said at last. "Use it wisely." She moved forward again. Every step along the aisle seemed measured not by distance but by courage, for she could feel the attention of the congregation gathering slowly around her like a tightening circle of expectation, and yet no one spoke her name aloud because no one wished to be the first to acknowledge the possibility of scandal before certainty required it. At the altar stood the Duke of Halverton. He wore ceremonial black, his posture rigid beneath the filtered light that fell across the chancel steps, and although he did not turn immediately at her approach she saw the moment recognition reached him, for his shoulders stiffened with a tension he could not conceal even from those seated nearest him. Beside him stood Lady Margaret Ashbourne, composed and pale in ivory silk whose delicate embroidery shimmered faintly with each movement she made, yet there was nothing fragile in her expression as she followed the direction of his gaze and saw Eleanor standing within the aisle. For a single suspended moment no one moved. Then Lady Margaret spoke first. "I believe," she said quietly, though her voice carried farther than expected within the vaulted silence, "that we are about to receive an unexpected guest." The officiating clergyman hesitated, uncertain whether ceremony or discretion required precedence, and that hesitation created the narrow space Eleanor needed. She stepped forward until she stood within clear view of the altar. "I beg forgiveness for the interruption," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of every eye upon her, "but there exists a matter of truth which cannot remain unspoken before vows are made." A murmur stirred the congregation at once. The Duke descended one step from the altar. "You should not be here," he said under his breath. "You told me to trust you," she answered. "I have come to do so." Before he could reply, Captain Pembroke entered swiftly through the side aisle, his presence drawing renewed attention toward the front of the cathedral as he approached with a bundle of folded papers held tightly in one gloved hand. "Your Grace," he said formally, though his voice carried unmistakable urgency, "these documents were delivered to me at dawn by a solicitor acting under instructions he believed confidential." The Duke accepted them without question. Lady Margaret watched him closely as he unfolded the first sheet, her composure unbroken though the color faded slightly from her face as his expression changed with each line he read. "What is this?" she asked. "Proof," Pembroke answered quietly, "that correspondence between His Grace and Miss Whitcombe was deliberately intercepted by persons acting under authority connected to your guardian's estate negotiations." The congregation stirred again, this time with unmistakable alarm. Lady Margaret did not retreat. Instead she turned slowly toward Eleanor. "Then it seems," she said with measured dignity, "that silence has been purchased more dearly than anyone present understood." The Duke folded the final document and looked at Eleanor with an intensity no longer restrained by caution or calculation. "I denied you," he said aloud, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral, "because I believed silence would protect you." "And now," she asked, "now I understand that silence nearly destroyed you." He removed the signet ring from his finger and placed it deliberately into Eleanor's gloved hand before the assembled witnesses whose expectations had gathered only moments earlier to observe another union entirely. "Before God and every soul present," he said, "there has never been any lady to whom I entrusted my honor except Miss Eleanor Whitcombe." Lady Margaret inclined her head slowly, neither humiliated nor angered but unmistakably resolved. "Then you must not hesitate further," she said, stepping back from the altar with quiet grace. "For I will not stand where another lady's truth has already been spoken." The clergyman lowered his prayer book. No one breathed. And as Eleanor lifted her eyes toward the Duke, she understood with sudden certainty that he still did not know the most dangerous truth she carried within her heart. that by the following spring there would be 3 lives bound by whatever decision he made next. The cathedral did not empty at once after Lady Margaret withdrew from the altar, for society rarely surrendered spectacle without hesitation, and the congregation lingered beneath the vaulted ceiling as though uncertain whether they had witnessed scandal or salvation, while Eleanor remained standing where she had been left, the Duke's signet ring still resting within her gloved palm like a promise that required completion rather than explanation. Adrian Hawthorne did not immediately speak again. Instead he descended the remaining steps from the chancel with deliberate composure, his expression no longer guarded by calculation but opened by decision, and when he reached her side the silence surrounding them seemed to settle into something steadier than curiosity, as though even those assembled to judge now waited to understand what courage might accomplish when it finally arrived, too late to be polite and too early to be safe. "You should not have been required to defend yourself alone," he said quietly. "I was never alone," Eleanor answered, though her voice carried a gentleness shaped by exhaustion rather than reproach. "I carried what you entrusted to me." His gaze dropped instinctively toward her hands. "The ring?" "No," she said softly. "The truth." He drew a careful breath, as though the word itself demanded reverence. "Then I will carry it with you now," he replied. Captain Pembroke stepped forward at that moment, speaking with discreet urgency that suggested the cathedral's patience would not remain indefinitely charitable. "The Archbishop's representative will expect clarification before the hour concludes," he said. "London will expect more before sunset." Adrian inclined his head once, acknowledging both obligations without surrendering attention from Eleanor's face. "Then London shall have truth," he answered. He turned toward the congregation, whose whispered speculation had begun again in cautious threads along the pews, and raised his voice only enough to be heard clearly rather than dramatically, for he had never relied upon spectacle when conviction would suffice. "My intended marriage this morning," he said, "was arranged under circumstances I believed necessary for the protection of my estates and those who depend upon them, yet I now understand that no protection purchased at the cost of another lady's honor can be defended before God or society." The statement moved through the cathedral like a bell struck without warning. "Miss Whitcombe," he continued, "has suffered unjust silence through my actions, and I will not permit that silence to continue another hour." Eleanor felt the weight of those words settle around her with unexpected steadiness, for they did not erase what had passed between them but reshaped it into something visible enough to withstand the scrutiny she had feared only hours earlier. When they stepped together from the altar and moved slowly down the aisle, the gathered guests parted without instruction, creating a path that seemed less like retreat than recognition, and Eleanor understood that reputation, once wounded, might still be restored when truth appeared publicly enough to replace rumor with certainty. Outside the cathedral the winter light had softened into something almost gentle, though the air remained cold enough to remind her how fragile warmth could be when exposed too quickly to expectation, and she paused upon the topmost step before descending fully into the square. "There is something I must tell you," she said quietly. He did not answer at once. Instead he offered his arm with formal steadiness, guiding her toward the waiting carriage that bore the Halverton crest newly uncovered beneath its winter covering, and only when they stood beside it did he turn fully toward her with the attention she had waited weeks to receive without interruption. "You may tell me anything," he said. She placed her gloved hand lightly against the carriage door but did not enter. "I believed I could protect you by silence as you believed you could protect me," she began, her voice calm though her pulse trembled beneath the words. "Yet there is one truth neither of us can protect by concealment any longer." His expression changed with immediate understanding, though not yet certainty. "You are leaving London," he said. "That truth I already know." "No," she answered. "I am not leaving." The simplicity of the statement unsettled him more visibly than accusation might have done. "Then you will remain beside me," he said. "If you wish it," she replied. "I do not wish it," he answered. "I require it." She drew a slow breath. "Then you must know why I cannot depart even if I wish to do so." His hand tightened slightly upon the carriage rail. "Tell me." For a moment the square seemed to quiet around them despite the movement of servants and carriages preparing to depart, and Eleanor understood with sudden clarity that whatever she spoke next would determine not only her future but the measure of the courage he had just claimed publicly before witnesses who would repeat his declaration across London by evening. "You told me once," she said gently, "that the snowdrop blooms before the frost has finished with the earth because it trusts that winter cannot last forever." "I remember," he said. "I did not understand then how much faith such a flower requires." He watched her closely now. "I understand it now," she continued, her voice lowering slightly though her steadiness did not falter. Because there is another life that must trust us both to endure this winter together. The meaning reached him before the words completed themselves. He did not interrupt her. He did not step away. He waited. "I am 6 weeks with child," she said. The silence that followed was unlike any silence she had known before, for it carried neither judgment nor hesitation but something deeper and far more dangerous, decision arriving without preparation. Adrian Hawthorne did not ask whether the child was his. He did not calculate consequences. Instead he removed his glove slowly and placed his bare hand over hers where it rested against the carriage door, his touch steady and unmistakably certain. "Then our child," he said quietly, "shall never know a day when his parents stood apart through fear of society's convenience." Eleanor felt something within her chest loosen for the first time since the ballroom where he had denied her beneath the chandeliers, and though the square around them remained crowded with observers who would soon transform this moment into rumor or legend, she no longer felt their presence as threat but as witness. The Dowager Duchess approached then from the cathedral steps with the composed authority of a woman who had anticipated precisely this conclusion from the beginning, her expression softened not by surprise but by satisfaction earned through patience rather than interference. "My son," she said calmly, "you appear at last to have discovered the difference between duty imposed and duty chosen." He bowed his head slightly. "I should have discovered it sooner." "You discovered it in time," she answered. "Which is all society ever truly grants us." She turned to Eleanor then with unmistakable warmth. "You will return to Halverton House with us at once," she said. "There is no further reason for you to remain anywhere else." Eleanor hesitated only long enough to understand what acceptance meant when spoken so plainly before witnesses who could no longer pretend ignorance of her place beside the Duke, and when she stepped into the carriage at last she did so without the uncertainty that had accompanied her departure only days earlier. Adrian followed her inside and closed the door behind them, shutting out the murmured astonishment gathering across the square as the Halverton crest turned once more toward the northern road. For several moments neither spoke. Then he reached gently for the snowdrop pendant still hidden beneath her glove and drew it carefully into view where the winter light could touch its delicate silver petals. "I should never have asked you to carry this alone," he said. "You did not," she answered softly. "I carried it because I trusted you would return." He fastened the chain properly around her wrist once more, not in secrecy now but with deliberate tenderness that required no witness to confirm its meaning. "Then let London speak as it chooses," he said. "For this time it will speak truth." As the carriage began its steady journey toward Halverton House, Eleanor looked once more through the window toward the cathedral whose bells had been prepared to celebrate another marriage entirely, and she understood with quiet certainty that the child she carried would one day hear this story not as scandal but as inheritance, because before those bells had rung a duke had chosen love over silence, and a lady who had once walked alone beneath falling snow was now returning home where she had always been meant to stand.